Hello, I'm Simon. Welcome back to my workshop. Now in this video I'm going to make a project which I think would be great to share with your grandchildren. It'll give them a chance to make something in your workshop that they will treasure for the rest of their lives. This is a hand tool only project, part of my shed series, so it will also come with a full guide and plans which you can access from a link in the description. Now I don't have grandchildren, so you might be asking yourself what qualifies me to know if this is a good project for your grandchildren. So let me explain. One of my friends at my local men's shed built this project at primary school when he was 9 years old. He's kept this project all of his life and he showed me some photos, and this is what this project's based on. It's a stool. It's a very simple and easy stool to make. It'll take a few hours, but I'm sure those hours will be remembered for the rest of those young people's lives. So let's get tinkering. For this project you're going to need one 5 foot by 6 inch 3/4 inch board. Because I'm using reclaimed wood, I've got two shorter boards that are 6 inches wide and 3/4 inch thick. The first thing to do is to make sure the end of your board is square and doesn't have any blemishes or splits in it. If it does, just mark off a square bit and then cut it with the panel saw. Mine is already square because I cut it on my table saw, so it's good to go. We're doing a project based on a 1940s design, so all my measurements are going to be in inches. Mark a square line across the board at 1 foot. If your panel saw is a little bit tired, then treat yourself to a new saw. I bought this Irwin saw. It's the 880 version and it was less than £10. I think I paid £8 for it. That's about, I don't know, $10 US. It'll make it a lot easier for your grandchildren to cut the wood if they're using a very sharp tool. Make sure that the piece is clamped down to your workbench or clamped in your workmate, which is what I'm using. It'll make it a lot easier to cut. And remember, we want to cut to just leave the edge of the line remaining. Now the trick here, something you can tell your grandchildren, is to look at this line here, and when the saw is square, that line will follow through the reflection in the saw and out the other side. And as long as that's straight, then your wood will be cut square. You can use your thumb to move the saw backwards and forwards until you get it in exactly the right position on the line. Lay the first piece on top of the board and then mark your next line. This will produce two pieces that are exactly the same size without having to worry about measuring again. You can now cut this second board, remembering to cut on the waist side of the line. The boards should be the same size, but don't fret too much if they're slightly out. It's not going to make a great deal of difference to the overall project. These two 1 foot pieces are going to become the legs of our stool, so you might want to mark them up at this stage so that you don't forget that they're the legs. From the remaining board, mark another square line across the board at 13 inches. This will be the seat of the stool. Now I've got a knot here, so I'm actually going to make mine slightly wider to avoid this knot. So I'm going to add another ½ an inch roughly to this. If you have similar problems, consider those sorts of things. And cut this with the panel saw. Lay this piece on top of the remaining board and mark another line, and cut this with the panel saw. We're going to mark a line down the centre of this board, but first we need to find the centre. So set your square up so that it's roughly at the centre and make a mark on the board. Turn it round and make another mark on the board. Then you can see that you'll have a little gap between the two lines, and the centre of that gap is the distance that you need to set your square to. Just keep testing until you find that the lines match. With the distance to the centre now established, you can scribe your line down the length of the board. Now, in a departure from what you'd normally do when cutting a line, you're going to cut down the centre of this line so you completely remove it, so that you end up with two pieces exactly the same size. You'll be pleased to know that this is the longest and hardest cut of the whole project. So let's just recap where we are. We've got two fin strips that are the same width and they're 13 inches long. They're going to be the front and back of the stool. We've got a 13-inch piece that's going to be the top of the stool, and we've got two 12-inch pieces that are going to be the legs. We're now going to finish the cuts we need to make on the legs, and then we'll be able to start assembling the stool. Using one of the leg pieces, that's the pieces that are 12 inches long, you want to mark a line about 5 inches up. The exact distance doesn't really matter a great deal, but I think 5 inches looks about right. You then again want to mark the centre of that line so that you find the centre of the board. Now, using a small drill bit with a brad point on it, we're going to mark the centre and just drill through it. Now lay your second leg underneath the first leg that you've drilled a hole in. Make sure everything's flush all the way round and start to drill another hole using the pilot hole as a guide. Now take this piece off and finish the hole. Now, using a 32mm hole saw and our pilot hole as a guide, we're going to cut halfway through this board using the hole saw. Turn the board over and then cut all the way through. Now mark a line about 1.25 inches from the edge of each board and join the edge of the line up with the edge of the hole that you cut. Now cut on the waist side of this line until it joins up with the hole. Be careful not to scuff the hole with the saw as you get towards the end. And repeat on the other side. We need to cut some notches into these legs. So first put the front piece on top of the legs so that the ends are flush like I have it here, and then mark the width of the front piece onto the leg. Now with the two pieces flush, mark the width of the notch. Do this for both pieces. With the piece clamped to the bench, cut the notches out. Now you'll want to keep the waste pieces from this cut as we'll be using them later. So this is what we're aiming for. I've not screwed any of this yet, it's just held with the clamps. Now the original one had screws here to hold the side pieces to the legs, and then those screws were filled with wood filler so that you couldn't see them. I'm going to do something very similar, but if you wanted to be a bit fancy you could drill and dowel it and that would look equally great. And from the photos I couldn't tell how the top was screwed on, so I'm going to use some of these blocks that we had left over when we cut out the side pieces to hold the top onto the frame. Now to attach these side pieces to the legs, I think it looks better if the legs are indented by about 3/4 inch. You could do it like this, but it exposes all this joint, and if there are any errors in the cutting, little gaps and things, they'll be visible. Whereas if you just indent it a little bit, they disappear in the recess that you've created, so it'll look a lot nicer. And I'm going to mark a line, the thickness of the board, in from each end. I'm then going to mark another 2 lines, the thickness of the board in from the line I've just scribed. I'm now going to use my square set to 3/4 inch to draw a line in on both sides. And then I'm just going to find the centre between these 2 lines and mark it. And this is going to be where I'm going to drill the holes for the dowels. And this is going to be where I'll drill the pilot holes for the screws. I now add a countersink using a countersinking bit. We now just need to sand everything down. These inside pieces are best done with a sanding stick. To give me a fighting chance of getting this board in the right place, I've clamped a square to this board and I've put 2 screws in the holes already, and they're slightly protruding, and I'm going to use them to mark where I need the pilot holes to go. So I'm going to line up these lines here with this board, and when I'm happy and I can see that it's nice and square along there, I'm just going to push down to mark the 2 holes where I need to pilot the screws. I've deliberately made these countersinks large because I'm going to fill over these with some wood filler. And I'll now repeat this process, screwing the screws in so they just protrude, marking the point where the pilot holes need to go, drilling the pilot holes and screwing the board in place. Fitting the other side is much the same, although you don't need the square this time. If you found, as I have, that the last position doesn't actually line up very well, then just ease it out slightly so that it's in line before you mark where your pilot holes need to go. I'm going to use these in the corners like this, with one screw going down here and then two screws on the sides going into this piece. I'm going to start by unscrewing this piece. Now I can access this. I should drill these pilot holes through here into here, get some appropriately sized screws and screw it in. Because I'm using reclaimed wood, I've taken mine all apart now so that I can give it all a good sand and get back to pure wood. I've finished sanding the old varnish off, so now it's time to glue and screw it all together. We now need to screw the top on. If you find it's not flush all the way round, just get it flush on one side, have a slight overlap on the other, which you can either sand or plane later. I'm using my dad's old number 4 plane to plane this, which I restored in one of my earlier videos. To fill the screw holes you have a choice. You can make up some sawdust and PVA glue and use that. You can fill the holes with sawdust and drop in some CA glue and then spray it with accelerant, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is use a commercial wood filler. Now we can sand the filler. I can now soften all the edges with sandpaper. Everything is sanded down nicely. I'm now ready to remove the dust using a tack cloth. And now for a few coats of water-based polyurethane. This has had 3 coats of water-based polyurethane and the project is now finished. And I hope you agree it's a simple but elegant design and something that your grandchildren will enjoy making with you in your workshop. I will have plans and a step-by-step guide in the video description. Just click on that link to download it. If you've enjoyed this project, then please leave me a thumbs up because it really helps the YouTube algorithm, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.